In the very heart of the whispering woods, where the tall pine trees seemed to touch the clouds and the streams chattered over smooth gray stones, there stood a small log cabin. This was the home of a man named Elias Vane. Elias was a hunter, but he was not the kind who tracked rabbits or deer. His prey was far more dangerous. He hunted the creatures that most people only spoke of in hushed tones around a flickering fire, the shadowy beasts and magical monsters that lurked in the deep, forgotten corners of the world. His life was a solitary one. His cabin had only one chair by its stone fireplace. His table was set for one. The quiet sounds of the forest were his only music. This loneliness was a heavy cloak he wore every day, a feeling that had settled into his bones over many years. People in the far-off villages knew of his work and respected his skill, but they were also nervous around a man who spent so much time with monsters. Their fear kept them at a distance, and so Elias had become used to his own company. He was a man of few words, with a face that was weathered and lined from years spent facing harsh winds and dangerous foes. His eyes, a serious shade of gray, often held a distant look, as if he was remembering something sad. He carried a secret sorrow inside him, a story of a loss from long ago that he never shared with anyone. It was this old sadness that made the quiet of his cabin feel so very deep. On this particular morning, the quiet was broken by a practical need. Elias opened a wooden chest and found it nearly empty. His stock of special supplies was gone. He had no more silver-tipped arrows for dealing with creatures that feared the metal, and his last strong coil of rope had been used to mend a fence. With a soft sigh, he pulled on his heavy boots and his worn green cloak. He would have to make the long journey to Raven's Bend, the only market town large enough to sell the unusual things he needed. He did not look forward to the noise of the crowded streets or the suspicious glances from the townsfolk. He simply locked his cabin door, shouldered his empty pack, and started down the narrow forest path, leaving the familiar silence of his home behind him. He was going to town for supplies, and he planned to come right back. He had no idea that his lonely life was about to change forever. The journey to Raven's Bend was long and dusty. Elias walked for hours, the familiar solitude of the woods gradually giving way to the well-worn dirt road that led to the town. By the time the wooden gates came into view, the sun was high overhead. The noise hit him first, a loud and constant rumble of voices, clattering carts, and merchants shouting over one another to sell their wares. He pulled his cloak a little tighter, the fabric feeling like a thin shield against the bustling energy of the place. He moved through the crowded streets with a clear purpose, his eyes scanning the signs above the shops. He found the Fletcher and bought a dozen arrows with gleaming silver tips. He visited the rope maker and purchased a strong, new coil that could hold the weight of a full-grown boar, or something much larger. The shopkeepers took his money with quick, nervous smiles, eager to finish their business with the quiet, grim-faced hunter from the woods. With his pack finally full, Elias felt a wave of relief. His task was done. He could now return to the peaceful silence of his cabin. He turned to leave, heading for the main square that led back to the forest road. But the square was not its usual self. Instead of people milling about or shopping, a large, restless crowd had gathered in a wide circle around the old wooden platform that was used for announcements or for selling livestock. A bad feeling, A cold prickle at the back of his neck made Elias stop. He was not a man who enjoyed crowds or spectacles. He tried to skirt around the edge of the group, but the press of people was too thick. From his taller height he could see over the hats and hoods of the townsfolk. On the platform stood the town auctioneer, a thin man with a sharp face and a voice that could scratch stone. He was not holding a chicken or a lamb for sale. Beside him, bound in chains that shone too brightly under the sun, stood a young woman. Her head was bowed, and her long hair hid her face. She stood perfectly still, a statue of misery amidst the murmuring crowd. The auctioneer grinned a wide, unpleasant grin and raised his hands for silence. "People of Raven's Bend," he called out, his voice slicing through the chatter, "gather round for a most unusual opportunity, a rare lot, the last one of her kind." He gestured dramatically toward the woman, who flinched at the movement. "I give you the final survivor of the Hollow Coven. Yes, you heard correctly. A real-life witch from those cursed woods." The crowd gasped and took a half-step back as one. Elias did not move. He just watched. "The stories are true," the auctioneer continued, his tone becoming more serious, almost ominous. "She carries their misfortune with her, a true curse upon her soul. Bad luck follows her like a shadow. Now, who among you is brave enough or foolish enough to take her off my hands, sold as she is, with no returns accepted?" He laughed then, a short, harsh sound that was not funny at all. The people in the crowd began to whisper to each other, their faces a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. They looked at the woman as if she were a poisonous snake, fascinating to see, but something you would never want to touch. No one stepped forward. No one called out a price. They all just stared, believing every terrible word the auctioneer said. Elias stood among them, his supplies forgotten in his pack, his journey home delayed. His eyes were fixed not on the auctioneer, but on the lonely figure in the silver chains. The auctioneer's words hung in the air like a bad smell. The crowd remained silent and unmoving, a wall of fearful people held back by a superstition. The man on the platform scowled, his performance not having the effect he wanted. He was trying to sell a dangerous story, but the danger was too great for anyone to want to buy it. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and impatient. "Do I hear a single copper?" He called out, his voice losing its dramatic flair and becoming more annoyed. "Surely someone needs a strong pair of hands for chores. Think of the novelty of it." Still, no one spoke. A few people shook their heads. One woman made a small sign with her fingers to ward off evil, hiding her hand quickly in her apron pocket when she thought no one was looking. The young woman on the platform, Lyra, did not look up. Her shoulders were slumped in a posture of complete defeat, as if she had heard all this before and expected nothing else. She was a problem nobody wanted. Elias watched her. He was a man who had spent his life learning to read the subtle signs of the forest and the creatures in it. He knew the difference between a predator's aggressive stare and a frightened animal's frozen panic. He saw the way her bound hands trembled slightly. He saw the exhaustion in the way she stood. This was not the posture of a great and powerful witch waiting to unleash a curse. This was the posture of someone who had given up all hope. Her loneliness reached out to him across the crowded square. It was a feeling he knew intimately, a cold companion that had lived in his own cabin for years. It was a deeper, heavier chain than the silver ones on her wrists. The auctioneer's story about a curse was meant to make her seem powerful and frightening, but all Elias could see was someone who was utterly powerless and alone. He thought of returning to his empty cabin, to the single chair in the silence, and the thought suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. The auctioneer threw his hands up in frustration. "Very well, if there are no bids, we will 5 silver. The voice was low and calm, but it cut through the murmuring of the crowd like a knife. Every head turned. Every eye widened in surprise. The crowd parted slightly, creating a path between Elias and the platform. The auctioneer's annoyed expression vanished, replaced by one of pure shock. He leaned forward, squinting to see who had spoken. The hunter stood with his arms at his sides, his face unreadable. He did not look like a man making a joke. 5 silver coins, Elias repeated, his voice clear and firm. He stepped forward, the people shuffling out of his way. He walked to the edge of the wooden platform and looked up at the auctioneer, his gray eyes steady. The auctioneer found his voice again, though it was now laced with confusion. You heard the warning, yes? The curse? She is bad luck. I will not give your money back when your crops fail or your roof caves in." Elias did not even glance at him. His attention was on Lyra, who had finally slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, dark and deep, met his. In them he saw a flicker of confusion, and a tiny, fragile spark of hope that looked like it might go out at any second. "I have lived with curses before," Elias said, though he was not entirely sure who he was saying it to, the auctioneer or the woman. He walked up the short steps onto the platform. The auctioneer took a step back, suddenly unsure of this grim-faced man. Elias ignored him completely. He moved to stand in front of Lyra. He did not grab her or pull her. He simply looked at the silver chains around her wrists. He drew the hunting knife from his belt. The metal of the blade gleamed. The crowd gasped, thinking he meant her harm. But with a careful, precise movement, he slid the tip of the blade into the small, weak link of the chain. With a sharp twist of his strong wrist, the metal snapped apart. The chains fell away, clattering loudly on the wooden boards of the stage. For a moment, there was no sound at all in the square. Lyra stared at her freed hands, her expression one of pure disbelief. She rubbed her wrists where the metal had bitten into her skin. Then Elias did something he had not planned. He put away his knife and turned his hand palm up, offering it to her. It was not a demand. It was an invitation. After a long, hesitant moment, Lyra slowly, carefully placed her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. A simple, quiet agreement passed between them, a pact made without a single word being spoken. He helped her step down from the platform, and together they turned their backs on the stunned crowd and the speechless auctioneer, and walked away without looking back. The silence that followed them out of Raven's Bend was heavier than any noise from the market. Elias led the way, his stride long and steady, but he was acutely aware of the woman walking a few steps behind him. Her footsteps were soft, hesitant, as if she was not quite sure she was allowed to be there. The weight of the stares from the townsfolk pressed against their backs until they finally passed through the wooden gate and the forest road stretched out before them. A welcome tunnel of green and brown. Elias did not know what to say. He was a man of actions, not words, so he acted. When they reached a small, clear stream bubbling across the path, he stopped. He took his water skin, filled it with the cold, clean water, and offered it to her first. She looked at it, then at him, before accepting it with a quiet nod of thanks. Her eyes, he noticed, were less fearful now, more watchful, taking in the details of the trees and the sky as if she had not seen them in a long time. "My name is Elias," he said finally. The words sounded too loud in the quiet woods dot. After a moment, she spoke. Her voice was soft, a little rough from lack of use, but clear. "I am Lyra." It was a start. They continued walking. The afternoon sun began to dip lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. Elias found a sheltered spot under a large, ancient oak tree whose branches spread out like a protective roof. He unpacked some bread and hard cheese from his supplies and shared it with her. They ate in silence, but it was a more comfortable silence now, the kind shared by two people who were simply tired, not strangers. As they walked, Elias watched for the strange signs of the curse the auctioneer had promised. He was a practical man, and he believed in being prepared for danger. But the bad luck did not come. In fact, the opposite seemed to happen. When the path ahead was blocked by a fallen tree too large to climb over, Elias began looking for a way around. But Lyra paused, placing a hand on the rough bark. A gentle breeze sighed through the branches above, and a large limb, tangled with the main trunk, shifted and creaked, rolling just enough to create a narrow space they could squeeze through. Later, a sudden, cold rain began to fall. Elias muttered, remembering he had meant to treat his cloak to repel water, but had forgotten. He moved to unpack it for Lyra anyway, but the moment his fingers touched the worn fabric, the rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving the forest smelling fresh and clean. He looked up at the retreating clouds, then at Lyra. She was looking at her feet, but he thought he saw the faintest hint of a smile. These were not the events of a curse. A curse would have made the tree immovable. A curse would have turned the drizzle into a downpour. This felt different. It felt like the forest itself was helping them. When his small cabin finally came into view, nestled in its clearing, a wisp of smoke still rising from the chimney, Elias felt a peculiar sense of relief. He pushed the door open and gestured for her to enter. The inside was just as he had left it, simple and orderly. The single chair by the fire, the table set for one. "This is it," he said. "You are safe here." He showed her where he kept the food, the extra blankets, and the lantern. He pointed to the small loft. "You can sleep up there. It is dry and warm." Lyra stood in the middle of the room, hugging her arms. She looked at the chair, the table, the hearth, and then at him. For the first time since he had seen her on that platform, the deep sadness in her eyes seemed to soften, replaced by a dawning sense of wonder, of disbelief that this kindness was real. The corners of her mouth turned up into a small, but genuine, smile. "Thank you, Elias," she said, and her voice was a little stronger than before. Outside, the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside the cabin, for the first time in many years, the silence did not feel empty. It felt peaceful. A new rhythm began in the small cabin. The first few days were quiet, filled with the careful movements of two strangers learning to share a space. Lyra was like a shadow, moving softly, and trying to stay out of the way. She watched Elias with a quiet intensity, learning his habits, the way he organized his tools, the time he liked to eat his meals. She was waiting, Elias realized, for the other boot to drop. She was waiting for him to change his mind, for the kindness to run out. He did not know how to tell her it would not, so he showed her instead. He carved a second wooden bowl for the morning porridge. He brought out an old, slightly wobbly stool for her to sit at the table with him. He left a spare blanket folded neatly at the bottom of the ladder to the loft. They were small actions, but he saw her notice each one. Then, one morning, he woke to the smell of something other than his own plain cooking. Lyra was by the hearth, carefully stirring a pot of oats she had found. She had added wild nuts and a drizzle of honey, turning his usual bland breakfast into something warm and wonderful. It was the best meal he had eaten in years. That small act of courage seemed to break the last of the ice between them. She began to help more openly. She swept the hard earth floor with a bundle of twigs. She weeded the small vegetable patch behind the cabin, her fingers gentle on the plants. Elias noticed that the vegetables she touched seemed to stand a little straighter, their leaves a little greener the next day. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, the comfortable silence felt different. Elias was mending a tear. In his pack, Lyra was watching the flames dance. "The Hollow Coven," she began, her voice so soft he almost did not hear it. Elias stopped his work and looked up. She was still staring into the fire, as if the words were easier to say to the flickering light. What the auctioneer said, it was not true. Not the way he meant it. Elias put down his sewing. He just listened. "We were not evil," she continued, her voice gaining a little strength. "We were just different. My family for generations, we could feel the life in things, the energy in the soil, the song in the wind. We could encourage it, help a sick plant grow strong, help a dry patch of earth find water. It was a small magic, a quiet magic. It was for helping." She explained how a powerful and fearful king, many years ago, had heard stories of their abilities. He wanted to use their magic for himself, to make his armies strong and his enemies weak. When they refused, wanting only to live in peace with the forest, he became angry. He sent his soldiers. He spread terrible lies, calling them a coven of witches, saying they cursed the land and brought blight and misfortune. The real curse was his greed, Lyra said, a hint of old pain in her words. The silver chains, they did not hold any magic. They were just cold and heavy. They made it hard to think, hard to feel anything. They made my magic, the little bit I had left, go to sleep. They made me feel weak and sad. That was the only curse, loneliness and fear. Elias thought of their walk through the woods, the shifting tree branch, the rain that stopped, the things that happened on the path here, he said. The good luck. A real smile, the first true one he had seen, touched her lips. That was not luck. That was just me, feeling safe enough to listen again. The forest and I, we were just saying hello. I asked the tree for help. I asked the clouds for a little more time, and they listened. That is all it ever was. Elias looked at this woman who had been sold as a terrifying cursed creature. He saw her kindness with the plants, her quiet help around his home, the gentle magic of friendship she was weaving into his lonely life. The auctioneer had been right about one thing. She was powerful, But her power was not in curses. It was in making things grow. It was in healing what was broken. And as he sat there in the warm glow of the fire, Elias Vane felt something old and frozen inside him begin to thaw. The peace that had settled over the cabin was a fragile thing, like the first thin ice on a pond. For several days it held. Elias and Lyra fell into a comfortable routine. He taught her how to track a rabbit and where the best berries grew. She showed him how to encourage the herbs in his garden to grow fuller and more fragrant. The cabin, once a place of silent solitude, was now filled with the soft sounds of shared chores and quiet conversation. They were building a trust, brick by careful brick, but the outside world had not forgotten them. In Raven's Bend, the story of the hunter who bought the cursed witch had spread from the town square to the tavern and into every home. It was the most exciting thing to happen in years. At first, the story was told with fear. People warned that Elias was surely doomed, that his cabin would be reduced to ashes by a lightning bolt called down by his angry new companion. But as days passed and no disaster struck, the story began to change. The greedy auctioneer, who had been happy to take 5 silver coins, started to feel a nagging doubt. If the woman was not cursed, then what was she? The stories of the old coven spoke of magic, of making crops flourish, and finding hidden springs. A different kind of greed, colder and more calculating, began to grow in his heart. He gathered a few other men, ones who were easily swayed by promises of wealth and power. "Think of it," he whispered to them in the dim light of the tavern. "If she can truly make things grow, we could be rich. We could have the finest farms in the valley. We could charge people for her blessings. That fool hunter does not know what he has. He is wasting her talents in the woods. We should collect her, for the good of the town, of course." And so early one morning the real danger arrived. Elias was chopping wood outside when he heard the unmistakable sound of many footsteps crunching through the forest. He straightened up, his hand tightening on the axe handle. A moment later, the auctioneer and 5 other men stepped into the clearing. They carried clubs and thick ropes. Their faces were set in hard, determined lines. The auctioneer smiled, but it was not a friendly sight. "Hunter," he called out, "we have come for the witch, our property." Elias moved to stand between the men and his cabin door. "She is not your property. You sold her. She is not a witch. Now leave." Lyra, hearing the voices, appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. Seeing her seemed to make the men more eager. "She does not look cursed to me," one of them muttered. "Looks useful." The auctioneer took a step forward. "This is your last chance. Hand her over. We have no quarrel with you." Elias did not move. "You have no business here. The deal is done." With a nod from the auctioneer, the men began to fan out, surrounding the cabin. Elias backed toward the door, his mind racing. He was strong and a good fighter, but he was 1 against 6. He could not protect Lyra this way. They were trapped inside. Lyra was trembling. This was her greatest fear come to life. Not monsters from the shadows, but the greed and cruelty of men. She saw the desperation on Elias's face as he barred the door. She heard the men outside, their voices growing louder and more aggressive. As they started to push against the walls, then something inside her shifted. This was her home now. This man was her friend. She would not let them take that. She closed her eyes, pushing her fear down. She reached out not with her hands, but with her heart. She thought of the ancient oak that had sheltered them, of the stream that gave them water, of the whispering pine trees that stood guard around the clearing. She did not ask for revenge. She asked for help. She asked for protection. Outside, the wind, which had been still, suddenly roared to life. It whipped through the clearing, snapping the men's cloaks and forcing them to shield their faces. The old oak tree groaned, its branches swaying violently. Then the very earth around the cabin seemed to stir. Thick roots, gnarled and strong, pushed up from the soil like waking serpents. They twisted around the ankles of the startled men, tripping them. They coiled around the legs of the one who was trying to break down the door, pulling him away. The men cried out in terror. This was not the magic they had imagined. This was not a magic of riches and easy growth. This was the raw, wild power of the forest itself, and it was angry. The auctioneer, his face white with fear, stumbled backward, falling over a root. "It is the curse," he screamed. The real curse. The men did not need to be told twice. They scrambled to their feet, tearing themselves free from the grasping roots, and fled into the woods, their cries of fear fading into the trees. In a moment the clearing was empty again. The wind died down. The roots settled back into the earth, leaving only churned soil behind. Inside the cabin, Elias turned to look at Lyra. She opened her eyes, her breathing shaky. The forest had answered. She had not fought with violence, but with a strength far greater. The real danger had arrived, and it had been met not by a curse, but by the fierce, protective heart of a home. The silence that returned to the clearing was different from before. It was not the quiet of loneliness, but a deep and peaceful calm that settled after a storm has passed. Elias unbarred the cabin door and stepped outside. He looked at the disturbed earth where the roots had risen, a permanent reminder of the protection that surrounded his home. He looked back at Lyra, who stood in the doorway, her hands still clasped together from her intense concentration. The fear in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet strength he had not seen before. They did not say anything for a long time. They simply stood there, listening to the normal sounds of the forest return. A bird began to sing again from a high branch. The leaves rustled in a gentle, ordinary breeze. A danger had truly passed. The men from town would not return. Their superstitions and their greed had been replaced by a healthy, lasting fear of the whispering woods and the powerful guardian who lived within them. In the days that followed, something between them changed. The last walls of uncertainty crumbled away. They had faced a threat together, and they had won. Elias no longer saw a woman he had rescued. He saw a partner. Lyra no longer saw a protector she owed a debt to. She saw a friend she would fiercely defend. They talked more easily now, their conversations filling the cabin with a warm hum of companionship. They planned together. Elias showed Lyra his maps of the forest trails. Lyra pointed to places where the land felt sick or sad, and they would go there together. Elias would clear away the deadfall and debris, and Lyra would kneel and place her, hands on the soil, encouraging life to return. They became stewards of the woods, a team. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. They sat together on the stump outside the cabin. Elias had brought out a second chair he had made, so they could both watch the day end. "This is your home, Lyra," Elias said, his voice firm and sure, "for as long as you want it to be." Lyra looked around at the clearing, at the sturdy cabin, at the garden now bursting with life, and finally at Elias. "It is my home," she agreed. A full, genuine smile spread across her face, the first of many. "Our home." Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had not felt since. He was a very young man. The lonely hunter was lonely no more. The cursed woman was cursed no longer. They had both been saved, not by a grand act of magic, but by a simple act of kindness. He had taken her hand, and in doing so he had found a family. The stars began to appear one by one, tiny points of light in the vast, dark sky. Sitting there side by side, they knew that their story was not about curses or monsters. It was about the quiet magic of friendship and the incredible strength found in a place. To belong, the end.